I think for the US, what that means is really bolstering its tech sector. And I think here it's on the part of the US to start testing out the limits there, not just the limits in terms of what China will or will not be happy with, but what will the business community be happy with. Much of the relationship between the US and China has been predicated on the preferences of the cross-border business community. And prior to the Trump administration, let's say, it was overwhelmingly positive. And so, with respect to the Asia region, I think the US long-term interest is to make sure that our allies are protected there.
In the intensified US-China tech rivalry era, depending solely on technological restrictions won't suffice. Limiting Chinese talent may impede US leadership in science and technology. Revising immigration policies to foster innovation and draw global talent, including from China, is vital. Rebecca Liao, founder of Saga and former foreign policy advisor for Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden's campaigns, provides insight into the current state of Sino-US relations. She underscores the historical influence of the cross-border business community's preferences on the dynamics between the two nations. US President Donald Trump finally increased tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods to 25% from 10%, and is threatening to do more. China's blocking of Google and Facebook and America's extraordinary paranoia over Huawei reflects a new low in the relationship between the two giants. The confrontation between China and America is now full-blown, and across sectors ranging from foreign trade, more than $700 billion a year and accounting for 13% of America's world trade, to digital technologies and media. Rebecca Liao sheds light on how the relationship between the US and China has been significantly shaped by the preferences of the business community. Linked to the United States' extensive history of overseas involvement in conflicts, it's evident that combating militants in power is not a new challenge, and likely won't be the last. Presently, the United States' focus appears to be squarely on China. With defense spending surpassing the combined budgets of the next 10 nations, totaling around $850 billion annually, and showing a consistent upward trend, exemplified by the 2024 budget request of $911 billion, substantial resources are allocated to military efforts. A significant portion of these funds has been directed towards militarizing the Asia-Pacific, with the establishment of military bases and the conduct of provocative war games symbolizing the U.S. military's assertiveness. Rebecca Liao highlights the crucial need to safeguard allies in the Asia region. Despite the acknowledgement that not all regional nations are supportive, she emphasizes the enduring necessity of U.S. engagement in maintaining lasting peace and stability. Now, let's break down what this all means, of course, with Rebecca Liao.
I do think that the greatest strength that you have in any of these negotiations is to take care of your home situation first. So I think for the US, what that means is really bolstering its tech sector. And you would think sometimes that when you look at the tech sector here, that doesn't really need any additional help from the government for sure, but really from any other organization or body in the world, because it honestly leads in innovation. That may be true, but in terms of implementation, growing businesses, making sure that our intellectual property is protected, all those things do require some involvement from the government. And so I would encourage the Biden administration, they've done much of this already, to really engage with the tech sector to make sure that all of our crown jewels of technology, whether that's AI, whether that's quantum, that they are protected and fostered. And with respect to how we allow for the distribution of that intellectual property overseas, or whether we allow for foreign entities to invest in our tech companies, I do think that there needs to be some guardrails around that. The most important thing is disclosure, first and foremost, which I think the Biden administration has been a big advocate of. But when it comes to actually curtailing some activities and some cross-border business, I think here it's on the part of the US to start testing out the limits there, not just the limits in terms of what China will or will not be happy with, but what will the business community be happy with. And this is probably the most important factor in all of this. So much of the relationship between the US and China has been predicated on the preferences of the cross-border business community. And prior to the Trump administration, let's say, it was overwhelmingly positive. You wouldn't meet a business person who did not want to, a US business person who didn't want to do business in China, and vice versa. And I think since the Trump administration, that feeling has definitely cooled off, some of it in response to the reality of regulation. But I think also that people who run businesses and watch their bottom lines and check their growth all the time, they understand that there are some realities of competition now. And so I think more and more future administrations, certainly this current administration, will have to rely on guidance from that business community in order to determine what the rules of engagement will be. And so with respect to the Asia region, I think the U.S. long-term interest is to make sure that our allies are protected there. We recognize that not everybody in the region is friendly to those allies. And depending on the administration that is in power, there may be some interest in making sure that the world is safe for democracy. That's certainly an admitted goal of U.S. foreign policy. But I think at a baseline, everyone can agree that the U.S. presence is necessary for achieving peace and stability on a long-term basis. And for many of these conflicts that flare up, left to their own devices, I think that they would spill over and become larger regional issues and perhaps be more destructive than they need to be. I think the U.S. has proven itself to be a great stabilizing force for any region in which it stays involved and engaged.
Since Biden's election, political and business stakeholders have been paying close attention to the direction of the new White House administration's policy toward China. For the past half-decade, Chinese state media have criticized U.S. policies as decoupling, warmongering, hegemony-seeking, imperialist, and dangerous meddling. While Biden claims there's no effort to contain China, the evidence indicates otherwise, and Biden's ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, is explicit. The U.S. seeks to isolate China in Asia and beyond. According to Rebecca Liao, as we move forward, the primary challenge is to identify pathways for collaboration while simultaneously recognizing the fundamental disparities between two major global forces. Despite these varying interests, both sides bear a collective duty to safeguard stability and promote peace within the broader global framework. Let's shift our focus to a video.
Well, it's been a very interesting evolution because I would say that one of the few general policy bends that the Biden campaign and now administration has agreed with the Trump administration on is that we do need to be tougher on China. We do need a change in policy. So I have been in the China political scene for a very long time, have been observing both their political and economic policies and their impact on the greater Asia region. And we remember a time when in the 90s, China was booming for the first time and everybody was eager to do business. Then in the 2000s, I think there was this great hope that as this growth continued in China, that there would also be an opening up to the international order and greater reforms on a domestic level. And I think what both President Trump and President Biden are responding to is the fact that many of the hopes of the international community have not been realized. Now, for very different motivations, I think President Trump tends to think about foreign policy in a much more America-centric way, whereas President Biden is committed to our alliances around the world and especially strengthening our alliances in the Asia-Pacific region. But nevertheless, there is this focus on China as an area of interest. I think that the Biden administration's policy is best captured in the policy phrase that they've been using for the last 3 years, which is strategic competition. So on the one hand, we can definitely find ways in which we can work together and collaborate. And there are certainly big issues like climate change, for instance, or global financial stability, certainly health, in which we can work with one another. But acknowledging that with the rise of China, there is now a competitive dynamic, particularly in the technology sector. And with that comes concerns around national security and the need for potential industrial policy to combat this kind of competition. And so the relationship has changed over time. But one of the great things about President Biden is that he has been around for a very long time, and he is incredibly experienced in foreign policy, and he knows when things need to be slightly adjusted. And I think that we went through a period in which we were frankly barely on speaking terms with China. And I think we all realize that that was not necessarily productive as a way forward. And so you can see with recent visits from Secretary Yellen, for sure, but also Secretary Blinken recently, that there is an opening up now. Let's try to find more ways to work with one another while acknowledging the reality that these are two great powers and our interests are not always going to be aligned. But nevertheless, we have a responsibility to the world order to preserve stability and peace.
The U.S. pushing for a war with China is not new or surprising, but we have to do everything we can to stop the push before it escalates. Why exactly does the U.S. need to maintain its hegemonic status over China? And why are our politicians and policy experts so obsessed with the idea? We value your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments.